Kia ora koutou. Right now, in the middle of 2025, you'd be forgiven for feeling like the world has gone full circle back to the 1930s. In a depressed global economy, fascists everywhere seem to be fanning the flames of national pride and stoking fears of various others who are somehow both a thing to be mocked and an existential threat. I'm not going to even come close to discussing every single country on this little planet of ours, but this talk is rather an attempt to touch on just some of the examples of far-right political threads globally, aiming to put us in a good place to then open the floor to discussion. First, let's quickly cover some terminology. So I'm using the term right in a political sense to mean a commitment to maintaining capitalism, which is the system of resource accumulation and thus hierarchical division of society into those who hoard resources from others and those who produce resources for others. The haves and the have-nots, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalist class and the working class. Some have a more extreme commitment to maintaining this system. We might call these people far-right. That term encompasses a broad range of people, including those with a strong economic and political theoretical knowledge, who are intentionally leading and often misleading the general public, through to those who misinterpret the source of their disaffection and choose to become militant against public health measures, against woke ideologies, such as equal rights for women, or against immigrants who are often fleeing much harsher conditions elsewhere. Those who are conservative want to maintain the status quo, which the status quo currently is the same as supporting capitalism. Some conservative and far-right leaders use a populist approach, appealing to working class disaffection to gain support, essentially meaning that those supporters end up working against their own class interests. Reform means changing bit by bit the current system to something more palatable. And while we welcome positive reforms, such as an increase in the minimum wage, we are certain that by definition, the system of capitalism cannot ever be sufficiently reformed to be fair for everyone. Therefore, we support revolution, meaning moving forwards to a new system of egalitarianism and justice. Conversely, the greatest extreme rightward is fascism, a brutal combination of authoritarian rule, scapegoating, militant mobilization in defense of capital, and destruction of leftist organizing and resistance. Contrary to whatever nonsense internet horseshoe theories might claim, revolutionary socialism and fascism are diametrically opposed. They're opposite ends of a spectrum, from egalitarian welfare on the social left to exploitative hierarchy on the far right. Sometimes people attempt to describe particular aspects of fascism or groups active within fascism, so you'll sometimes hear terms such as eco-fascist, crypto-fascist, or Christo-fascist, and that's just describing far-right actors who want to depopulate, who want to organise online, or who adhere to particular selected religious ideas. Sometimes new terms are invented, which are unhelpful, distracting, and incorrect. So, for example, we're not moving into an age of so-called techno-feudalism. We most certainly remain under capitalism, and the far right are capitalism's staunch defenders. Before we move on, it's also important to note, however, that this single spectrum that I've been outlining of economic organisation does not pretend to describe all ways humans relate to each other. And the left-right spectrum is useful for a lot of analysis of present-day politics, but it doesn't describe all present-day political situations, and it certainly doesn't describe a lot of pre-capitalist history. Bear in mind that people can still be crappy without being far right. So I'm going to go through a few areas of the world. We'll start with the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. Was founded in 2013 on an anti-European Union platform, incorporating xenophobia and Islamophobia. The AfD has rapidly become a serious far-right political threat, gaining 12.6% of the vote in 2017 through to holding 24% of the seats in the Bundestag federal parliament since February 2025 elections. This means the AfD is a mere 2% of parliamentary seats behind the leading party. Chancellor Friedrich Merz's centre-right Christlich Demokratische Union Deutschland, or the Christian Democratic Union. So Alternative for Deutschland advocates ethnic nationalism, a return to blood-based citizenship, and the deportation of immigrants, an idealised white nuclear family, and the dismissal of university professors for leftist, woke gender ideology, all reminiscent of a Germany 9 decades past. According to European television station Art, Germany has the largest number of violent far-right activists in all of Europe. There are only 3 registered political parties currently formally recognised by Germany's Interior Ministry as right-wing extremists, and they're National Demokratische Party Deutschland, Die Reich, and Der Dritte Weg, so the National Democratic Party of Germany, the Right, and the Third Way. But there are many more street movements such as Unitas Germanica, Abstatt, Forsheim Revolt, as well as party youth wings. So disrupting LGBTQI plus celebrations and rallying in the street against immigrants. These groups, you also use social media platforms to effectively spread their messages. New and well-established street groups have been organising together, and the groups appear to be growing in size, in number, and in threat. So November 2024, arrest of members of a neo-Nazi militant group called Saxony Separatists that casts a light on the threat some of these groups pose. Saxony Separatists members had been training themselves in urban warfare, intending to violently overthrow the German government. 3 of the arrested SS members, and yes, that's their acronym, of course, were linked to now mainstream party Alternative for Deutschland. France's Front National, or the National Front, was formed in the 1970s by Jean-Marie Le Pen. Since 2011, it's been fronted by his daughter, Marianne Le Pen, whose express aim is the de-demonisation of the National Front. This includes a rebrand to the more mainstream palatable name Rassemblement National, or National Rally, in 2018. But nonetheless, the party's far-right politics are still very clear. In 2018, former Trump advisor Steve Bannon addressed the party convention, receiving a standing ovation to the words, quote, "Let them call you racist, let them call you xenophobes, let them call you nativists. Wear it like a badge of honour, because every day we get stronger and they get weaker. God bless America and vive la France," end quote. ISO member Martin Gregory has written in detail about the snap French parliamentary elections, which took place in June and July 2024, describing, quote, "the hastily formed left coalition, Nouveau Front Populaire, consisting of Jean-Luc Mélenchon's La France Insoumise, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, Greens, and other lefts, including Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste," end quote. This left coalition won the most seats, but not an absolute majority. Despite the success of the coalition bloc, Rassemblement National is the single party which received the most votes in the Assemblée Nationale, or the National Assembly, so making it a continued significant threat into the future. Marianne Le Pen says ominously, quote, "the tide is coming in, it didn't swell enough this time, but it keeps growing, and thus our victory has only been delayed," end quote. French authorities report France has almost 3,000 violent right-wing extremists, and Europol reports that France accounts for almost half of far-right terrorist acts committed or intercepted within Europe. These street forces are most visibly represented by Group Union Defense, Union Defence Group, whose rally behind an ideology of revolutionary nationalism. This is the same ideology that led to the formation of the Front National, which is regret for loss of empire and rejection of socialist ideas. And street forces such as the Group Union Defense maintain close links with Rassemblement National. From its beginnings, Zionism has been a colonial and genocidal concept, supported by imperial superpowers. I struggle to conceive of a version of Israel that could be anything but far right, But even so, there's a spectrum amongst Israelis and their supporters, a spectrum on which current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and many others are pushing rightward as much as possible. Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, participated in the recent celebration of the 1967 annexation of East Jerusalem, a day of Israeli street marches, violence against Palestinians, storming of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, headquarters, and all while the crowds chanted "Death to Arabs." Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement about this was supportive, quote, "We will keep Jerusalem united, whole and under Israeli sovereignty. This is, of course, connected to the current war, the war of rebirth," end quote. It would be hard at this point to be unaware of the so-called war to which Netanyahu refers, in what has been described as the world's first live-streamed genocide. Israel continues to rain bullets, shells and bombs on Palestinians in Gaza, while carrying out a simultaneous campaign of terror, kidnap and torture. As of late May 2025, Al Jazeera reports 62,614 Palestinians killed since October 7th, 2023. It's highly likely those figures will greatly increase as bodies are located beneath rubble, as people die from injuries and disease and malnutrition, and unless there's a dramatic change of course, the genocide continues unabated. But the so-called war isn't limited just to genocide in Gaza. Israeli settlers with Israeli military support harass and threaten and kill Palestinians in the West Bank, persistently expanding settlements and claiming land and resources. Palestinians continue to live under apartheid and occupation, and this is even as Israel continues in conflict further afield with Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. In Argentina, former television angry rant personality Javier Milei has held the presidential seat since December 2023. Rather than having a cohered base of his own, the election of Milei is considered to have been more of a vote against the pseudo-leftist norm. But nonetheless, he has proceeded to implement a range of austerity, anti-labour and privatisation measures. Milei's La Libertad Avanza, or Freedom Advances Party, has also set about securing power in local elections, winning local control of Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires. Milei is a paragon of libertarianism, or as he calls it, anarcho-capitalism. The Eurasia Business Review, for example, fawns over Milei having eliminated Argentina's fiscal deficit. All this required, according to that publication, was disruptive policy, such as eliminating the ministries of culture, health, labour and social development, austerity measures including eliminating subsidies for energy and transport, which has caused severe economic hardship and increased poverty, and privatisation of state-owned firms and anti-labour legislation. We've got a number of far-right threads of our own to pull here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, not least of which the Christchurch mosque mass murderer of 2019 was motivated by the far-right Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which holds that the white race is being diluted or outbred by non-white immigrants. This is an extreme confluence of nationalism, racism, and xenophobia, and is a line of thinking which, as we saw, has murderous consequences. These ideas aren't unique and are in fact maintained in mainstream consciousness by more organised actors here in Aotearoa as around the world. So the ACT Party, generally going under the acronym for their full name, which is Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, has been actively trying to shift New Zealand politics further rightward since its inception. Although ACT uses libertarian rhetoric, the party nonetheless displays an authoritarian approach, pushing forward its policies despite overwhelming opposition. ACT staunchly supports and advocates for the extremes of capitalism and social competition, attempting to erase all threats such as the Treaty of Waitangi principles. Compared with ACT, New Zealand First is more explicit in its advocacy of nationalism, conservatism and xenophobia. The party recently announced the so-called Fair Access to Bathrooms Bill, which seeks to emulate the USA's attacks on transgender people's use of toilets as part of a divide and rule strategy. In 2023, the party campaigned on policies which included New Zealand means New Zealand and not Aotearoa New Zealand, intending to make English the primary official language of New Zealand, presumably erasing the other two official languages, Te Reo Māori and New Zealand Sign Language, to withdraw from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, opposing hate speech legislation, enforcing biological requirements for gendered sport, and ending vaccine mandates. There are more extreme right parties, or at least there are other far right parties which are less accomplished at obfuscating their antisocial intentions, but those parties failed to gain any seats in recent elections. So such parties include the New Conservatives, New Nation Party, New Zeal, Democracy New Zealand, Vision New Zealand, and Freedoms New Zealand. Despite their electoral failures, behind these parties are organised street movements or other networks, such as Brian Tamaki's Destiny Church, which is capable of occasionally mobilising thousands of militants against queer rights, abortion rights, or public health measures. At present, explicitly fascist groups such as the National Front and Action Zealandia appear to have crawled back into their caves to sleep off successive defeats from local anti-fascist organisers. And I'll just move to talk about a couple of supranational groups. Talked about a few locations in Europe, but the European Union as a whole recently had some parliamentary elections, which ISO member Martin Gregory detailed. He wrote, quote, in Germany, the AfD, Alternative for Germany, came second with 15.9% of votes. In Austria, Freedom Party of Austria came first with 25.4%. In the Netherlands, Party for Freedom came second with 17%. In Italy, Brothers for Italy came first with 29%. In Spain, Vox came third with 9.6%. The most disquieting results were in France, where Rassemblement National and the National Rally came first with 31.4% of votes, which is more than twice that of President Macron's Ensemble group in second place, end quote. There are sufficient shared goals for these far-right parliamentary groups present to be felt, such as decreasing immigration or curbing efforts to address climate change. The result is that around a quarter of the European Union Parliament is held by the far right. They don't presently have enough for a deciding vote, but they're certainly established as a real political force, or read threat, and this will shift the tone of European political discourse rightward. So in my research, confusingly, there's a European Union organisation of anti-terrorist special intervention units set up in response to the September 11 attack on the World Trade Center, which is called the Atlas Network, which is a law enforcement agency, no doubt itself full of red flags. All it does is just, maintain the capitalist hegemony of Western dominance. There's nothing to worry about there. Let's talk about the other Atlas Network, formerly known as the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. The Atlas Network provides support, training, funds, ideas, connections for think tanks and other political groups around the world. Their stated vision is, quote, a free, prosperous and peaceful world where limited governments defend the rule of law, private property and free markets, end quote. Moreover, quote again, our goal is to persuade people of all backgrounds to value classical liberal principles and to consider policy reforms related to these principles, end quote. The Atlas Network claims to actively partner with over 500 organisations in 100 countries, and that's as much information as they share about most of their partners. They name only a few of those partners, and they're groups that I personally don't recognise. African Students for Liberty in Kenya, Epicenter in Belgium, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression in USA. So it's hard to gauge accurately the impact of this network. What we do know is that here in Aotearoa, ACT Party leader David Seymour has worked for several organisations which were members of Atlas. And ACT has a revolving door of staffers with the New Zealand Taxpayers Union, which is itself an Atlas member and right-wing think tank. Examples of recent ACT far-right policies include principles of Treaty of Waitangi Bill, which sought to undermine Indigenous sovereignty and undermine efforts to achieve justice for colonialism's impact on Māori, and now the Regulatory Standards Bill, which seeks to entrench property rights and libertarian economic calculations into all future legislation in this country. At the very least, it seems certain that the Atlas Network's ideology is strongly present in these legislative attacks. So we've done a little bit of an overview, and with some of the time left, we'll look a little bit at WTF. So we might argue that there's forgotten lessons from the past. The socialists have been organising against capitalism for a long time, and it's no surprise that capitalism fights back when threatened. And our ideas, still far from universally accepted, are sometimes overshadowed by a much larger base of people who believe in a compromise between the ideas of the right and the ideas of the left. On the surface, this can seem reasonable, upholding ideas of universal tolerance, democracy, and free speech. Historically, though, we know that the far right has always appropriated these ideas for their own ultimately authoritarian goals, and that there must be limits to our tolerance of hateful ideologies. And as younger generations become increasingly distanced from the lessons of the 1930s and 1940s Europe, fascism seems to some to just be a historical irrelevance rather than a present, very present, contemporary threat. So even ultra-capitalist USA was once on board with the idea of punching Nazis, an idea that both the far right and centrists alike would like us to forget. Many far-right actors in Europe have built their political rhetoric on a response to an influx of refugees and migrants over the past decade. Famously under former Chancellor Angela Merkel, the ruling Christliche Demokratische Union Deutschland party welcomed over 1 million refugees on humanitarian grounds. European far-right actors, particularly in Germany, have claimed that this has put an unnecessary economic strain on national resources. The Great Replacement theory is evoked to stoke hatred rather than solidarity for the refugees' plight. And thus, refugees have become a convenient other to scapegoat and to mobilise against. Maybe it's capitalism. Capitalism is a system of exploitation of the majority for the accumulation of the few. Capitalists must endlessly grow their wealth or themselves be consumed by their competitors. So we, the workers of the world, experience not just the majority of the fruits of our labour being taken from us, but also the thumbscrews of that exploitation ever tightening. So we fight back against the capitalists, and the capitalists in turn escalate their war against us, and this is class war. We build infrastructures to support our fight. We build political organisations such as the ISO here in Aotearoa. We build unions. We build campaign groups, and we create collective community support structures. The capitalist class sets out to destroy our infrastructure, to set us back, to subjugate us once more through the tool of fascism, disbanding union structures, threatening socialists and others who dare to speak up and organise, and ensuring the continued rule of business. Part of the explanation of the rise of the far right globally is that it is simply part of the back and forth of the class war. Another important part, though, is that recognition of the extent to which people sometimes act against their class interests. Sometimes this can be because a leader cleverly highlights a small personal benefit and obfuscates the bigger class picture, such as promises of tax breaks for all, or promises of economic prosperity if only those immigrants that we earlier talked about would go away. Sometimes this can be because a leader successfully taps into frustrations with the status quo. Even for the more privileged among the working class, we are often alienated from the product of our labour, always paid less than the value we produce, and we struggle to make ends meet and are always only one small misstep or misfortune away from falling into the capitalist meat grinder of joblessness, homelessness, and ill health. Recognising this and looking for some alternative, people may sometimes be swayed towards far-right ideas, such as make New Zealand first again. On the 19th of May 2025, New Zealand First leader and Foreign Affairs Minister, Winston Peters, co-signed a statement calling on Israel to, quote, allow a full resumption of aid into Gaza immediately and enable the United Nations and humanitarian organisations to work independently and impartially to save lives, reduce suffering, and maintain dignity, end quote. This statement has also been signed by Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, the UK, and various European offices. Finally, right? It remains to be seen the extent to which these countries are willing to act to back up the statement, but nonetheless, this represents a degree of mounting diplomatic pressure within the capitalist sphere of influence against at least some of Israel's actions. More inspiring and effective pressure might look similar to Colombia's actions to expel the Israeli ambassador and to newly establish an ambassador to Palestine. So it's diplomatic power, but what about people power? In Argentina, major union confederations have successfully called 2 general strikes, which have brought transportation and economic activity to a standstill. In Germany, hundreds of thousands have repeatedly rallied against the AfD and other far-right forces. One such rally was over 1 million people. Student encampments and mass rallies in support of Palestine have rocked the world, challenging every institution and government supporting the genocidal Israeli state. The Hikoi Mo Te Tiriti, as we talked about earlier, through Te Ika Maui in 2024, saw 100,000 Māori and Tangata Tiriti mobilise against the ACT Party's racist legislation here in Aotearoa. The earlier example of governments condemning Israel comes about not from any particular anomaly of kindness amongst the ruling class, but because of successful pressure from grassroots protest. While this talk has aimed to summarise the threat of far-right elements globally, I urge you not to step away from this with any sort of impression that those elements go unchallenged, or that those elements have any sort of assurance of victory in the face of our collective strength. There's some reading if you're bored. But there are so many parts of the world that we have not touched on, right? The United States of America has been discussed ad infinitum. We've also skipped over struggles in the Philippines and El Salvador, upcoming elections in Colombia and Chile, in which the far-right are a serious threat, and far-right street mobilisations in the United Kingdom and in Australia. What we have covered, however, are concerning increases of influence of far-right forces around the world. Those far-right forces take different forms, sometimes political parties attacking the working class or enacting extremist free market policies. Sometimes individuals stoking ultra-nationalist sentiment to rally political power. And sometimes street mobilisations of hundreds or thousands willing to inflict physical violence on those they deem outsiders. All of these forms ultimately defend capitalism from the threat that we, the working class, pose. Our task is not to back down, but to continue steadfast, to build our numbers and our capability in serious political organisations so that ultimately we can overthrow this system of exploitation. This is class war, and we very literally cannot afford to lose. Kia ora.